right, welcome Civic Innovation Fellows, year number 4. So this is our first discussion. Today, in the next hour and a half, you're going to get a cultural kind of understanding of how the city, like its structure leading up to where we are today, or at least our interpretation of history, and then going through community boards, discussing this terminology called community tech, and then ending with 311. So a little bit of a backstory is that there was this white, wealthy man named William of Orange who helped fund the Dutch Revolution that helped bring about the first modern republic in the Netherlands. And why this is very important is that he was keen on a few things. One is that he wanted to get the Catholics out of Spain because the Spanish were running a really repressive government in the Netherlands. Two, he was somewhat of an early idealist, what did I say yesterday? Enlightened individual, where he believed that we should be using technology to kind of like free thought and share ideas. He was a Protestant, and so he was very keen on having Calvin's words spread across all of Europe and do a reformation and kind of bring about the end of Catholicism. Now, what's interesting is that, it's the printing press is essentially what he was talking about, which is a very important form of communication and pretty much, the most useful form of technology to share information for hundreds of years. So we speed up the clock a few decades. The Dutch Republic, the first modern Dutch Republic, is going out and setting up these businesses. And one of these businesses was the Dutch East Indies Company, right? And its charter was essentially to go and capture as much wealth from the New World and bring that back to Europe. Very, colonial, imperialist mindset. Go forth and find all the poor brown people that are around the rest of the world and enslave them and bring all that wealth back to the Netherlands. Now, what's important to note about that relationship around the sense of commerce and New Netherlands and New Amsterdam in particular is that the port of New Amsterdam and New Netherlands was the first colony in the United States that was focused on commerce, not religion, not religious freedoms, not someone running away to protect their religious ideology, but it was really structured around capitalism. And how do these white Europeans come to a new world and generate as much capital as possible? It's ironic that New York continues to be the financial capital of the world, and some say that it's kind of dated back to really this idea that the Dutch founded New Amsterdam and New Netherlands under the framework of taking capital and all oriented around capitalism, mercantilism. Now, I should also talk about the original inhabitants of Manhattan, which is the original name of the island that we're on. One thing that's important to know that and I'm saying this quickly and I'm forgetting, they were the tribe? Lenape? The Lenape tribe. They were the dominant tribe in the area, but they were not the only tribe in the area. And so if you look at some of the history books, and there's this great book called The Island at the Center of the World, talks about the Lenape believed that if you can't own the water, and if you can't own the air, how can you own the land? And so that we lived in a collective relationship with the world that was around us. And for them, as they were the dominant tribe in the area, but there were many other tribes that were coming in and out because this area was super rich in its sea life and shellfish, that they welcomed the Dutch somewhat and said, sure, come on by. And this whole narrative around how the Dutch took advantage of the Lenape is told in a pejorative way around the Lenape as like, look how dumb the Indians were to give up and sell Manhattan for a bunch of trinkets. It's that actually the Lenape were entering into a common agreement of collaboration with the Dutch. if you can't own the water, you can't own the air, nobody owns the land, and so we're just going to collectively farm it, and we're just going to live together. And for the first several decades of New Amsterdam, you see this kind of like tension and this battle between these two ideologies, between collective ownership of land and territory versus capital or individual ownership of land and territory, which sets up a lot of the first colonial conflicts of the area. There are a few other stories that are interesting to tell that impact or that inform the broader conversation around the Bill of Rights, which are the first how many amendments to the U.S. Constitution?
10.
Bingo! All right, so freedom of speech. So the First Amendment is around freedom of speech and freedom of religion, right? So the federal government cannot make a law that impacts speech or the practice of religion. And those two actually come from, one can make a relationship to the fact that the Dutch colony, when the Dutch fought their revolution against the Catholic crown in Spain, that they were very keen on being the technological pioneers of the printing press and making sure that they could say whatever they wanted. And that's actually one of the tools that they had against the Spanish crown, is that they would print anything and everything for other people who were fighting the Spanish crown. So you could actually go to the Netherlands and get all of your pamphlets that would rail against the Spanish crown printed, and then be able to be subversive and distribute them. Early bloggers of the day. The other thing is the Dutch Republic was very keen on religious protections. So this is one of the reasons why you see early Jewish settlements. You see a lot. I mean, this island, this colony, was founded on one thing and one thing only, which was making money. And as long as you could help us make money, that's what the Dutch were open to. So the Dutch had a very permissive framework around religion. So Peter Stuyvesant, one of the governor generals of the island, is noted as wanting to kill off a Quaker settlement, a British Quaker settlement in Queens. And he's like, I want to kill the Quakers because the Quakers won't, A, they're pacifists, so they're not going to fight back, and B, I don't want to have to send my people to go defend the Quakers because they're not going to fight, right? I'm going to lose people by defending the Quakers. And so he wrote a letter to the Dutch government and said, okay, or the Dutch East Indies Company, can I kill the Quakers? And they wrote back, we're sorry, but they are under the same laws as the rest of the Republic of the Netherlands, which means that you can't kill them because we believe that everybody can have freedom of religion. So feel free to grab some water. Okay. So some other stories of like how Central Park is actually like a mixed bag in this narrative, because not only was Central Park part of this destruction of there was a settlement, a very prosperous settlement inside of the boundaries of Central Park of freed African Americans and freed slaves that the city used eminent domain to destroy. But also, Central Park was designed for the rich. It was originally seen as an escape from the horse dung-filled streets of the Flatiron District, which was essentially like as far north as the city's wealthy had built in a concentrated like grid-like pattern. Teddy Roosevelt's home on 19th or 20th was once considered, like as far north as the gentry lived, right? And then, their mindset was, okay, well, we're going to grid out the rest of Manhattan, and in doing so, we're not making any public accommodations for the rich to have some free space. And so once they set out the grid, they realized, oh, well, we'll just take all these blocks in the middle, and then now let's use it. What are we going to do with that? And they had a public design competition, one of the most famous public design competitions. And people submitted from around the world what should be in the middle of Manhattan for the rich and the wealthy to enjoy. some of the submissions were so far as to build a big pyramid in the middle of the island, because, of course, what do you need? A pyramid is a lovely recreational device. And then there were a number of different plans that were submitted for parks and gardens. But the one that won was submitted by two essentially professional amateur park designers. And they hadn't had their business, they were just architects. They had they enjoyed parks and they enjoyed the public spaces of Europe and had been taking all their notes. And so they compiled this all the way into their submission. And they said, okay, great, we want to build this public park. And the commission said, that's a great idea. Here's the seed capital to now essentially start your business and to landscape what we now know as Central Park. But these were done through professional amateurs. So if you've seen the city's apps competition, big apps, it's kind of like, Central Park is like one of the descendants, not a descendant, big apps is a descendant of the Central Park apps competition. You build it for an elite group of people with the idea that eventually everybody would get to use it. Either of you participate in Kickstarter campaigns or GoFundMe campaigns? Well, the base of the Statue of Liberty is one of New York City's first Kickstarter campaigns. The statue said, hey, American city, any American city, please take this beautiful statue. We want to give it to you as a gift. And people were wondering, well, what city is going to actually pay for the pedestal that the statue is going to go on? And it wasn't up till the Hearst, Randolph Hearst, I believe. He's like, oh, this is a great idea to sell magazines and newspapers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to print the name of anyone who contributes to have the base of the statue built in New York City. And so he starts a campaign that publishes people's names in the newspaper if they contribute money, right? And of course, what happens back then, people want to see their name in print, right? It's the first time that they're going to be able to hey, I'm in the newspaper because I've contributed a penny to this particular campaign. And so he starts his booming business industry, and this is how we get the base of the Statue of Liberty. And so this is another element of New York City's foundation, which is around, at least from our side of things, it's about collective participation, collective funding, and the commons. An important tragedy to note is the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which creates the three very important changes in belief, kind of like advocacy that comes out of this tragedy. Do you know the tragedy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire? Where there were a bunch of women who were indentured of some sort and working in making shirtwaists, and the doors were locked, and they jumped to their death because the fire department didn't have the technology to actually do proper fire suppression. The building, New York City had been building so quickly that they actually hadn't thought through proper fire suppression technology, so there was no sprinkler system hadn't been created. The building codes the doors were locked, so there was, the egress was really these elevator shafts that once they collapsed and stopped functioning, everybody was trapped to their death. And on top of that, the labor conditions that these women had been fighting for were significant. And this time period, this 1911 event, really crystallizes the foundation of the progressive movement, which has a lot of things going for it, as well as it has some things going against it. And so this brings us up to the Roosevelts, kind of two bookends of the progressive movement. Progressive movement was very much focused on organic food, government transparency, education for everyone. Some of the drawbacks were that they believed in eugenics, where some people shouldn't have the opportunity to reproduce. Let me see if I can go to my other notes here. They believed in the suffrage movement. They didn't believe in immigration. They thought that we should limit immigration because there was enough immigrants to begin with. And then, painfully under the second Roosevelt's term, we get internment camps for the Japanese. And so you get to see another level of racism. But through the progressive movement, we get the federal income tax, you get direct election to senators, prohibition, you can argue yay or nay whether or not that was a good idea. But women's suffrage is a great idea, right? Happy that that happened. Muckraker, which is essentially using journalism to kind of tear apart these particular issues and become, this is turning journalism into advocacy, and then improving people's lives, and strong labor unions as well as strong government regulation. And this is important because that really sets the foundation of where we are today in New York City government. This building as a unification of the 5 boroughs. It's also a unification to have really smart and intelligent people within government, within the civil service system. And so the ideas of what we're fighting for in a broader movement under BetaNYC and the kind of like the whole civic hacker dynamic is framed around 4 key freedoms. So there's the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, freedom from want, which is essentially economic opportunity for everybody, and then the freedom from fear, which is that you shouldn't have to feel that your government is going to oppress you in any particular way, right? And those are the 4 freedoms that are at the foundation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They're the foundation of the UN Charter, and I would go so far as to say the work that is encapsulated within BetaNYC and what we do for kind of like the civic hackers is very much in the same way. Now, a bunch of organizations came together in 2011 to fight for the city's open data law, and they are the descendants of the progressive movement. So up here, these are members of the Transparency Working Group, which fought for and advocated for the city's open data law. And Citizens Union is actually started off as a political organization, and that was part of the Progressive Caucus, Progressive Movement. And then you have 2 descendants of the suffragettes, the League of Women Voters and the Women's City Club of New York. And those are 2 direct organizations that fought for women's suffrage. And all of us came together over a multi-year period, 2 years, to fight for the city's open data law, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Just to talk about contextualizing, that's the politics of where we are, and that's a very, very short rendition of a couple hundred years of New York City politics. But just to bring us to where we are today, $84 billion is our city budget, right? Do you think that's big?
$1 billion, yeah.
Yeah? So we have 8.5 million residents. We have in footprint, we have 302 square miles, which is really small, right? And then just think about how long this American operation, this European operation, has only been operating since the 1600s. So in its grand scope of things, it isn't that old. New York City government runs under a strong, it runs under a mayor-council system, and then a strong mayor form. Mayor-council means that we have public and direct elections to the mayor and to the city council. There's essentially another form of municipal government, which is council administrator, where you essentially directly elect the city council, and then the city council hires an administrator to operate the city. And then a strong mayor means that the mayor is in charge of proposing the budget, and the city council is to reviews the budget and then approves the budget, and then it's the mayor operates all the different agencies and kind of spends that money, right? So, and there's a number of different forms where you can have a weak mayor, which means that the city council is in charge of the spending of budgets, and so there's a number of different forms of democracy a municipal democracy, and this is just the one that we've been able to select over the last couple hundred years. New York City government is the fourth largest government in the United States, if you remove the federal government. It's California, Texas, New York are the three larger budgets and population sizes. New York City employs 325,000 people. That's like the city of Atlanta, right? That all work for the city of New York. And it's a crazy amount of people. We are fortunate to have, through our city charter, which is essentially our constitution, we have a bunch of other electeds, the public advocate, who's in this building, the comptroller, who's in this building. There are 4 other borough presidents, and then district attorneys. And those are the high-level elected individuals that we get to select that are just at our municipal government. And then we have our city council, and that has 1 speaker, though the public advocate is the president of the city council, and that's because of some reforms that happened in the 1980s, 1990s, where we now can directly elect the public advocate, who operates as the president of the city council, and then there are 51 additional members of the city council that are there. And then there are 35 different committees that the council has. All right, this is your New York City government. You'll all be required to memorize this flowchart and power dynamics by the end of the boot camp. Good. You got it? Okay, great. What you really need to know is just the high level operations of New York City government. So you're at the top. You're always at the top because you're the taxpayer. You're the one who votes. If you have the ability to, you're the one who can always send a letter to the mayor because you are the citizen, right? Or you are the constituent. And then we have some basic containers here. So there's 1 district attorney for every borough. You have actually the independent budget office, which isn't elected, it's appointed, but these people oversee and make sure transparency around the budget. You have the city council, as we have 51 city council members and 1 speaker. You have the public advocate, who's actually has a relationship to the city council as being the president of the city council. They also can sue the city, so they are your ombudsman person, right? They are, if you have an issue with one of these agencies, if you have an issue with one of the elected officials, the public advocate can actually take them to court and take the city to court. It's kind of weird, right? The city can take the city to court. Yeah, but that's one of the unique roles that the public advocate has, and the role and the creation of the public advocate is really amazing. Gail was when the president of the city council and the board of estimates was deemed unconstitutional in 1989. There was a good government effort to reform this government structure that gave us this ombudsman person, and actually Gail was the she was intergovernmental affairs for Dinkins, but she was also worked for one of the very first public advocates, if not the first public advocate. And then we have the mayor, directly elected by the citizens of New York. We have the comptroller, who oversees the budget and works with the mayor to essentially make sure that all the agencies are operating fiscally and legally. And then we have 5 borough presidents, and this is over here, and there are these things called borough boards, which are made up of all the community board, district manager, no, chairs. The borough board is made up of all the chairs from the community boards, the borough president, and then some elected officials that represent the island of Manhattan from the council, and then I believe representatives from the different agencies. And so that's replicated on all 5 boroughs. Manhattan has how many community boards? 12. Brooklyn has the most at 18. All right. And then
yes, 18. Good,
yep,
good.
yep, 18.
Agent Bruce, please call extension 8300. Agent Bruce, please call extension 8300. Thank you.
All right, Queens has how many?
Queens has, anyone want to take a guess? Manhattan's got 12, Brooklyn's got 18.
10, 9.
14.
Oh.
Bronx also has 12, and then Staten Island has 3.
Yeah.
Right? And one of the reasons why the Charter Revision Commission and there was like this illegality in 1989 was the fact that some of the borough presidents and this Board of Estimates infrastructure had 2 votes, and then the lower populated boroughs only had 1 vote. But that violated one of our constitutional guarantees, which is 1 person, 1 vote, right? So if you're gonna have a table of people voting around the table, everybody should have 1 vote, not you shouldn't weigh it in that particular way. So the most important thing out of this chart is to know where you're located on the org chart and who you're going to be dealing with. They're primarily over here, community boards, right? And then this is the rest of the city agency, and this is how the mayor kind of has organized everything, primarily going to here, the first deputy mayor, and then directly up to the mayor. So community boards are able to pull in all of the different agencies, depending upon what type of accountability they want to weigh, and they do this through a community district board, correct? Is it called the district service cabinet? And this is where it gets a little confusing, but this is where a community board is able to pull in agency heads and agency representatives around issues that they see or that are affecting their community. And so we're going to be dealing primarily with that little cluster up there in the upper left-hand corner. So the public advocate has another unique function that is it's almost vestigial now, in the sense that like we have morphed out of its existence, but COPIC, which is the Commission on Public Information and Communication. And sadly, like what was cool about the public advocate is that this was like a community board for open data, right? And would help call into question the city's type of licensing for communications infrastructure, and it was very forward-thinking, right, when it was put in place in the early 90s. But COPIC hasn't been properly resourced for the last 20-some-odd years. And so we've had to replace COPIC or move the responsibilities of COPIC into other locations like DO-IT, the city's information technology, or the mayor's office of data analytics, so that way we can at least get our data publications. The comptroller takes care of the budget, a whole lot of complicated financials. What's interesting about the comptroller is that the 2 comptrollers have been super transparent about how they spend their money. This is a legacy of good government and the advocacy work that the Transparency Working Group has been pushing forth. And so you can go to the comptroller's website and go to Checkbook 2.0, and you can see how much money to date the city has spent out of the capital budget, which is a really amazing thing. To think about $84 billion being tracked penny by penny, dollar by dollar, and all of that online, updated 24 hours a day, not too shabby, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So the form of government that we're going to be working on is community boards. And community boards come about through Mayor Wagner. I believe Wagner was once the borough president of Manhattan, and in 1951 he was elected mayor. As part of that, he had experimented as the borough president with these things called community planning councils. And this was a way to, one, to invest or divest power into the community to fight communism. The community planning councils and then later their organization under community boards was explicitly set up to be bureaucratic, to be under-resourced, and to fight against central planning. Now, we see community boards today as a great opportunity for civic engagement, public engagement, right? It's a touchstone. It's something that you, us, all of us can go petition, lobby, and engage in. So this is kind of like a benefit of the system, but sadly, it's they have been historically under-resourced, and our role through this program is to figure out how to bring new resources to the table for community boards to operate in the 21st century. And as part of that, we are going to train you this year to be community board data analysts, and what was the third adjective?
Support.
And support. So you're going to be providing reports, and you're going to be providing support to community boards and to borough president staff, who are called liaisons, who deal with community boards. And we're going to be assigning you research projects, and we're going to be assigning you tasks to essentially look at data and go out into the field, go to community board meetings, and help improve community board operations. We'll talk about that, our first assignment, at the very end of this presentation. So now, community technology. How many of you heard, do you know what civic technology is?
Technology that's used to engage activism.
Close.
Like,
Close?
What is it? Civics communications, what you said?
Civic technology.
Civic technology. I guess technology that facilitates, a more efficient political
activity. I don't know,
yeah,
like,
political activity,
activity,
or yeah, streamlining that political activity, making it more efficient.
Close, close. The broadest definition that people have come up with is technology for the public interest. Now, we used to call that nonprofit technology, NP Tech. There's been a number of terms that have been used over the years to talk about technology for the public good. Some people these days, they're like civic tech, technology for the public good. But some people see that nebulous definition, of that very broad definition, to include PayPal. Because PayPal can help you pay your parking tickets, so therefore it's somewhat civic technology. Airbnb is civic technology because it helps you connect with your neighbors. Uber is civic technology because in some places it helps you connect and go around and transport. So where is it going? Well, you in many ways, Facebook can be considered civic technology because it connects you to your neighbors. Civic technology is now, with such a broad definition, it's really hard to really understand, like, what type of technology are you creating to really help the public good. And over the last few years, there have been apps that have come out that allow for you to download and report on how sketchy a neighborhood is. Now, how do you define sketchy?
Just seems inherently subjective.
Yeah, and it's really expressing your bias of what is sketchy, right? And so as we have walked down this world of what is civic technology, some of us have started to realize, whoa. Civic technology is too broad of a definition. And our friends in Detroit, who have been dealing with like a post-capitalist society and a post-industrialized society, have seen people come in and we're like, whoa, we'll make things better. Like here, we're just going to digitize everything. It's just like, but not all of our people have access to digital infrastructure or digital networks, or we don't live necessarily. We live in the modern world, but we don't have the same resources as everyone. And so a portion of our community that BetaNYC is a part of is embracing this term called community technology. And I hate to be so nuanced about it, but it's the idea that technology is a method of teaching and learning about technology with the goal of restoring relationships and healing neighborhoods. And so our work through community boards and our work with CUNY undergraduate students is a way to kind of like bridge this world where we're able to foster stronger relationships, public relationships through community boards, and then also provide you an opportunity to think through how technology and all of the explicit bias that it can represent, you can harness those tools in new ways to be thinking about addressing community problems and addressing neighborhood traumas. And as you grow up, as you grow as an analyst or a designer or whatever, you're able to think about these things earlier on in your employment. I wish someone had taught me what this term existed 25 years ago. Then I would have been like, yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. And community technologists are those who have the desire to build, design, and facilitate a healthy integration of technology into people's lives, communities, with allowing them the fundamental human right to communicate, right? It's our ability to express our interest and our desires and to talk about our problems, right? And be able to communicate that up and then hopefully collaborate to address them and solve them. Did you have a question or?
No.
Okay. I just saw a potential half finger going up. So we're fortunate in New York City to have successive generations of kind of like advocates and professionals that are thinking about this world that we're in. And so we can point to Gizmo, which was founded in 1990 as a number of GIS professionals who were organizing to share professional data. And if it wasn't for Gizmo, our arguments for open data would be literally like 20 years behind, right? Because Gizmo, they were government employees who were using data, GIS data, to demonstrate the value of shared data. They worked on building base maps and doing data analytics on showing how you could save money from digitizing the city's school bus routing system, which was originally push pin and strings, and every year the Department of Education, Board of Education would go through and they would have an analytics department and they would be like, okay, we're gonna route this bus route this way through strings. And someone said, you know what? We have these things called computers and we can digitize this and we'll save time and money. And we'll be able to do it faster, and we'll be able to better address how kids get around. And this was done in the 90s, and they were all proof of concept of how can we fuse data together to provide a better functioning New York City. They continue to exist today. Now, what's another benefit from that period is that COPIC, we heard about them before, right, under the Public Advocate's Office, the Commission on Public Information and Communication, right? They produced the very first data dictionary that this nation has ever seen. It was a phone book. It was a phone book of applications. And one of the reasons why there was such fanfare to produce this is so that way Gizmo, they could hand out this book and they could be looking through and they could start thinking about what are the data sets that they could combine, but it also provided a progressive value in the sense that it provided transparency to the general public. So the general public now knew what were the data systems, the government information that was being collected or used across city government, and then how could advocates then ask for better digitized systems, or they would just be able to see what's going on inside. I bring up open source in New York City government or open source in government very briefly for the fact that a lot of our work is talking about transparency and accountability. Many arguments against open source are done in a way that says open source software is less secure because everybody can see the software code. But I have to remind anyone who ever says that to me is that from 1999 to 2006, the single largest adopter of open source software in the federal government was the Department of Defense, for the sole reason that they could see the software code. They could see where there were problems, and they could then apply patches and ensure that anyone else who was using that particular software code had the same patches applied to it. And so this whole general argument that openness and transparency actually creates greater insecurity is incorrect. It's fundamentally flawed. There's just as many bugs in closed source software as there are in open source software, but the benefit of having transparency in the code is that you can ensure that that transparency or those bugs are fixed. Yeah? All right. So how do you apply that at a municipal level? 311. right? You've got bugs, you've got problems, you see that they need to be fixed. So how do we go about doing that? So 311, introduced in 2002, becomes New York City's like public tracker of tracking what are called service requests. They're not complaints, though we sometimes call them complaints. They're really service requests because they can be from a number of different things. 311, after its introduction in 2002, 311 rolls in this thing called 211, which is a universal framework for healthcare providing and finding out about mental health services. So 311 is the one-stop shop for when do I have school today? Is alternate side parking in effect? Who can fix the lamppost? Where do I find after-school counseling sessions for me? Where do I find other pieces of education that I could, like what's an after-school program for my kids? How do I fix? I would like to report that my apartment's filled with mold, right? It's this one-stop shop for all these different issues. Now, we're gonna at the end of this, we're gonna ask you to essentially embrace the 311 suite of tools that are out there, and we're going to send you out into the streets to create 20 service requests. And over the course of the next 2 weeks, you're going to essentially report back on how those service requests what has happened to those service requests. And so all 9 of you are going to put those service requests into a spreadsheet, and then through this boot camp, we will go back to the different issues that you have essentially expressed in this 311 service requests that you've collected. But to think about where we've come from 2002 to now, New York City, because of Gizmo, because of our kind of like our GIS nerds in the city, in 2004 were able to, when was Gizmo launched?
1999.
No,
1990.
There we go. That's a very good answer. So 14 years later, huh?
It just came to me.
Yeah, good one. So 14 years later, New York City, and New York City still stands unique in this way when we talk about unifying data for public access. So you can go to this thing called what our elders of the community call NYC map, NYC map. So nice map. They're very funny. We're gonna introduce you to Goat and Acris and Pluto. There's so many fun little GovTech tools that have really fun names that we just can't wait to show you all of them. So Nice Map launched in 2004, and Nice Map gives you a single portal to kind of look at all of this government data, right? And all of this has been normalized so that way you can literally browse across the city and see all of these different types of issues that are going on in the city. And this is very much our argument for open data, which comes along in 2011, is about getting access to this data, right? Because we feel that if we can unlock this data, we can do cool things with it. And one of those cool things is Transportation Alternatives back in 2004 has to be commended for the fact that they were getting data from the state and then mapping fatalities, mapping where where pedestrians or cyclists were maimed by crashes. And they built this map that literally allows you to travel through time and to see how dangerous intersections have evolved. And they also did this in 2004, and we're super forward thinking. And the executive director who came up with this map is actually now the executive director of reInvent Albany, and he was one of the individuals that helped push for the city's open data law. So this is how open data can be turned into advocacy and help us hopefully build wiser communities. This was all done before Google Maps was released, and before Google Maps actually released its API. You know what an API is? It's an application protocol interface. It's a way to essentially talk to another computer. So before Google Maps you would essentially just have to use the interface, like the GUI interface, to slide around. And then Google Maps said, well, since you guys are already hacking our system, we're just going to document how you can hack the system, and so you no longer have to hack the system. You can just access the system, right? And you can make your own maps. 2006, Amazon Web Services is launched, which is essentially like powers everything on the internet these days. And this was before the iPhone was released. What? It's hard. This slide has kind of aged. I used to use the slide like 4 years ago, and it was just like, oh my goodness, you know, it hasn't been even 10 years since the iPhone was released, but now it's like, oh, 10 years ago, the iPhone was released. It's a long time ago. But these systems are relatively new in their grand scheme of things, right? They're still somewhat in their infancy. I don't think Twitter has made a profit yet. No, maybe they have, but how these systems can be hacked. So in 2008, there was a very important election that was going on that year. I don't know if you guys remember the election in 2008.
The president?
Oh yeah! Barry was running to become the number 1, and in the general election, a number of hackers were concerned that civic hackers were concerned that we would see the same type of election shenanigans that we saw in the previous elections, whether it was in Florida or Ohio. So, you know, things where like ballot boxes disappearing, or like a whole precinct with no functioning election machines, or the fact that like the voter roll all of a sudden disappeared. And so a number of us came together and we were like, oh, well, we could use Twitter and APIs and maps and workflows and all through open source and kind of like build a system that would help track all of these different components. And so in 2008, there was like 50,000 submissions to this system, and we had election protection protocols. So if somebody tweeted and said, I had a really bad experience at my poll site, we could then send someone from the National Lawyers Guild, like it went into this other digital workflow. And that's where I started to put on a much bigger civic hacker hat. 2008 is also a seminal time for like apps competitions. So Washington, D.C. is the first municipality to challenge its digital community to start making apps. D.C. had a very well documented data portal at the time period, so people could easily access the city's data, and that they were like, hey, why don't you build an app for us? I'm sure you could do that. Here's the data. In 2009, New York City launches its NYC Big Apps, which continues to run to this day. 2009 is also a seminal moment because President Obama, as his very first executive order, writes the Federal Open Government Initiative, which enshrines that transparency, participation, and collaboration are going to be his mantra for the next 4 years, 4+ years, right? And that sets off this whole wave of engagement around government technology and civic technology, or Gov 2.0, or Web 2.0, Civic Web 2.0. There were so many different terms. But in 2009, there's like this huge explosion of activity because now the technology is cheap with Amazon Web Services. The systems are put in place so that way there's APIs that are out there. People have these really advanced mobile communication devices like in iPhones and Androids, and so it's like, boom, like it's a whole new world. I feel like Fievel. I was proud to work on the state senate, and so here is an example of using open source code base. We put out APIs, so it was like really developer thinking. We embraced social media, and our mantra was transparency, efficiency, and participation. And as this is happening, Gail, in her infinite wisdom, which this is why we call her the fairy godmother of open data, she's like looking at all of this and being like, New York City needs an open data law. And so she takes what the framework around the White House Open Government Initiative and says, okay, Mayor Bloomberg, you're now going to have an open government initiative, and I want an open data law. And she hosts a series of hearings, and people are like, nah, it's too radical. But this is just way too crazy. New York City going to be transparent? But don't you know 9/11? Don't you know terrorism? Don't you know like why? Like we don't want to open ourselves up to any type of these types of vulnerabilities. And so the Transparency Working Group is established, which is a coalition of all those good government groups, progressive good government groups from the past. And we negotiate with the city for 2 years to get the city's open data law passed. And this is the bill signing ceremony. Now, what's amazing is that in that argument, the city itself starts to change. There's a massive culture shift. Bloomberg all of a sudden realizes that there's Bloomberg, who is the mayor, if you can't measure it, you can't govern it, starts to change his tone. He hires the city's first chief digital officer, which was to centralize and brand New York City government initiatives around internet access, technology education, open government, civic engagement, and then digital industry. And like shortly thereafter, the city just starts exploding with these different types of civic engagement tools. Either of you City Bike members? Mm-hmm. No? Okay. Well, anytime you pass by City Bike, just think that the city has asked the community where that bike station should exist, right? It not only went through the community board, but then went through like it made a presentation at the transportation committee, has gone out and hosted workshops itself with local elected officials, so that way they could find out where it's the best place to put that city bike station. On top of that, they've done the data science that looks at who are the people that are most likely to use the city bike, and let's make sure that we put the bike in a centrally located spot. To start that process, the Department of Transportation says, who wants a city bike station? And they started off with this map in 2011.
We don't have any on Staten Island.
I know. There's none on Roosevelt Island too. So there,
Really?
yeah.
We're not alone.
You're not alone. And so what was amazing about this map is that within a course of a few days, it went from like a couple hundred pins to thousands of pins. Another tool that was launched by the city in 2011 was, hey, how can we make the city a better place to live? Why don't you give us your suggestion? Change by NYC. So you could go up here, you could write on a little digital post-it note, and you could submit it. Now, let me ask you something. Do you see anything wrong with these two tools?
Anything wrong with it?
Yeah. Is there a bias that might come about collecting this data through a website?
Yeah.
What is it?
I mean, a way that I can think of making the city a better place might not be someone else's, like, opinion.
True.
It could be making it worse.
True.
But the sample that, so there's obviously going to be a bias in the group that would be more likely to even engage in this in the beginning.
Yeah,
So,
that's true.
I mean, I would suggest that it's probably you're getting more affluent people, or, people that are technology engaged already and that are able to utilize that. So there's going to be a disparity, income disparity.
Yes.
Yeah. So you're fundamentally talking about access, right? And who has access and who thinks that government can change, who thinks that government is listening to them and then is actually going to take that into consideration and make change happen. And so when we start talking about community technology and when we start talking about bias broadly, we have to be thinking about these types of systems, and that every single data collection methodology has a bias in it, and you need to be conscientious of that. Technology itself has a bias in it. This table that we're sitting at is elongated, right? And it is a medium, right? It is a medium for us and these chairs. This is all technology. We were all agreeing to kind of sit in this little ecosystem and have this conversation, right? Do you know what the bias is of this particular table? It has a header, and a footer, and then there's a bunch of people that are sitting in between. So if I'm sitting here at this corner, it's hard for me to see somebody that's sitting between you and Emily. And so therefore, in a conversation, if this was a circular table, everybody would have more of an equal representation because everybody could see each other and our voices could be shared. But in this particular way, there is a direction of power that is associated in the dialogue. And so there is a bias to this type of table setup. So if you wanted to have something that was a negotiation with a number of people around the table, maybe you would want to have just a very large round table instead of a table with a very explicit header and a footer. So these are the things that we want to start training you to see these things quicker than when we saw them as we were growing up. Same thing goes here. So here's New York City's online rules site. Now beforehand, the city was very progressive in the fact that you could subscribe to a newspaper called the City Record, and in the City Record it would have a listing of all the rules changes. Now you would have to cough up a couple $100s to get an annual subscription to the City Record, and then for you to make your comments known about the rules change, you'd either have to show up at the public hearing, or you'd have to send in a letter. Now, by 2012, the city said, oh, well, let's just digitize it. Let's just put it up online so that way everybody can have access to it. Now, it's democratizing access, but now if you're really going to be thinking through how are rules changing, how do you go out and solicit that community that's going to be affected by that rules change and ensure that they have an opportunity to engage in that dialogue and that conversation? The aspiration is that by having a digital tool, you can subscribe to that thinner slice of information.
Agent Diana, please call extension 8300. Agent Diana. Thank you.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's going to have that access to it, even by digitizing it. So by 2012, the city passes the city's open data law. And then now this opens up a whole other series of questions when it comes down to open data, open technology, and then civic design, which is fundamentally, okay, cool. So now we got access to all this stuff. We have government that's engaged in it, but now how do we heal communities that we know? Every single community has some type of trauma that's associated with. Every single human has some type of trauma that they've experienced. And now how do we go through a process and creating a process that enables us to heal? And I'm not saying the 3-in-1 is the panopticon for healing that, but this is our adventure that we're challenging you to go on, and that is we want you to start looking at the city as data. We want you to enter the matrix, and we're going to ask you to enter the matrix by downloading the 3-in-1 app if you can.
Oh, right now?
Yeah, why not? And in the neighborhood, you have 3 opportunities. So for the next 2 weeks, you will. Well, we're gonna give you a little pass here. So next week is Columbus Day weekend. CUNY's closed. But we know that you were supposed to start by September 11th or around September 11th, and we started a little bit after that, which means that you've got a bank of hours that you have access to.
They weren't supposed to start September 11th. They could start anytime from September 11th to the end of September when we started. We just started them at the later end. So some of their classmates may have started there earlier.
Yeah. Okay. So that means we want to give you an opportunity to kind of catch up, would be one way to putting it. You can. This is a very special opportunity, one-time offer. So think of it as you can. We would love for you to walk around this neighborhood, CB1, to document service requests because technically you're supposed to come to a work site. But we can make your work site either the community board that you've adopted. Have you adopted, either of you, community
They
board?
haven't been assigned yet.
Okay, so you can adopt a Manhattan community board and walk around that community board and document service requests, or you can also do it at home. But you have to capture 20, right? We want a sizable data pool, and we want a variety of issues. In the worksheet, I have a listing of the different issues. A majority of them you can access through the mobile app. The second 48% of the service requests you can still reference through the mobile website, and then I think a few of them you can call in. And we want you to be multimodal. We want you to use social media. We want you to use Twitter, use Facebook. If you want to Skype in a 311 service request, you can do that too. If you want to call in a 311 service request, you can do that. But we're encouraging you to document all of this through this spreadsheet. And this spreadsheet is going to be looking at time. So we want to know the date and time of the service request that you made. What is the service request number? Because they're going to give you a very specific number that we won't have access to otherwise, but you can then look up using that service request number. You can go to the 311 website and you can look up and see that track, and you can track that issue. We want you to track this type of service request, the descriptor, the location, the method of how you made that service request, and then we want your name, and then later on, as these issues get addressed, we're actually going to look these up in the city's open data portal because 311 has really strict PII, which is personal identifiable information. So they never publish the service request number on the open data portal. So later on, we're going to have to go back and use all of this other metadata to find your service request in the open data portal, and then we'll go from there, and then you'll be able to track resolution.
Wait, why don't they share that?
Because with the service request number that you're given, you can actually go to 311's website, and it'll give you all of the contact information.
Oh, so that's why
they don't publish it.
Okay.
But if you're calling in for services, or you're wanting to work with an elected official or a community board, what they normally ask is for the service request number, so that way they can track that, because the stuff that you get on the open data portal isn't as transparent. With the service request number, you'll see sometimes you'll see actually who you're talking to at the different agency, which they won't share that. Even if you've put a freedom of information request, you won't see that in the data that the city contributes. But you, as someone who filed the service request, get access to know who's taking care of your issue. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is why we want that service request number. We want to be able to go back and forth. We want to be able to document and see all of the cool, most innovative service request numbers that are out there. And you are all going to be handed your first kind of like lab sheet to work on. The first part of the lab is going to talk about community technology and how communication is a fundamental right. And so we want you to orient to be thinking about technology as you're using government technology, right? We want you to be thinking about what are the biases that are going to be expressed, who has access, who has control. Like if government is digitizing its infrastructure and its communication points, we want you to be thinking about that design, those design elements in the context of all the work that you're going to be doing, right? So there's a bunch of questions. And then we're going to ask you a little bit of history around 311. Why was it created? Where was it created? What was the first American city to have it? When did 311 launch in New York City? What is Open 311? Just some very basic things. These are the service requests that we want you to, at a minimum, to document. Pothole, damaged tree, leaky fire hydrant, building graffiti.
So with the app,
Mm-hmm.
is there like a way for people to like send pictures
Yeah.
and stuff like that?
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, and we want you to be taking photos of each other as you're going around and documenting it or doing selfies, because we're going to ask all of you to blog this year on BetaNYC's website, and so we want you to document the experience so that way we can hopefully recruit as cool of service fellows next year. So just we're going to think about you as the poster children of the awesome, innovative poster children for hopefully getting your next our next cohorts. And so document yourself. We have some questions to ask you before you go out into the field. Just to, once again, we operate under an agile loop, so we try to define some assumptions. We test those assumptions in implementation, and then we review those assumptions when we're done. So we're going to ask you a few things to consider in this process, and then lastly, you're going to adopt a community board, Manhattan Community Board, and we want you to go through and we have a survey of essentially the community board, so that you have a better understanding, and this document all of your source material, right? So if you use the city's Mayor's Office of Community Affairs to document what are its boundaries, document that. If you use the community board website versus the Office of Community Affairs, document that, right? What we want you to get into the habit of is building justifications for the statements that you make, because sometimes the internet can be correct and incorrect at the same time period, right? Depending upon what source material you look at, right? Did we land on the moon? Yeah, did we?
I don't know.
What?
I'm just kidding.
Okay. Is the Earth flat or is it round? Depending upon who you look at the internet?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I've traveled around the planet and I can definitely tell you it is round. So, I went this way and I came back, so it's round. Been there. I've also gone down like that. It's round. I've talked to astronauts. They've gone out. They've seen the whole thing.
Yeah, that's like a new thing. People really don't think it's round.
Yeah, I don't understand that. But what we want you to do is we want you to get into the habit of documenting the resources that you use, because that helps build the justifications. It helps document the research, right? So that way, it's if somebody asks, where did you get that number? Oh, I don't know where I got that number. We don't ever want you to be like, oh, I don't know. It's like, oh, hold on, let me get to my notes. Oh, I got this from the city's open data portal. Oh, I got this from the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, right? Oh, I got this from the Department of Buildings planner page, and here's the URL for me to get that. So always document your resources. And then what else is at the end of this document? Oh, cool. And then you get introduced to BoardStat. Yay, BoardStat! You'll be able to see what last year's class helped build as this tool called BoardStat. And then these are kind of choose your own adventure questions that we have put together that help you. You have to use, once again, the board that you've adopted, and then answer these particular questions. And then, yay. So you have till the 16th to get this done, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. You have the 16th of October, so you roughly have 2 weeks. As we said, we're going to be closed on Monday, which then is and then either of you come in on Wednesdays or Fridays? Fridays. Okay, some Fridays I may not be here. Emily may not be here on Friday, but we've given you enough work that's going to be very, very clear. We'll know if you didn't work those days because you didn't do the work. And that's kind of the name of the game. we're going to be assigning you stuff. You should be able to get it done while you're here, or at least during the hours that you've been carved out and that you've agreed to work. And this is going to be a party. It's going to be fun. You're going to go out and experience data, and you're going to help solve the civic problems of New York City, and start to understand community technology and see the biases. And then when we come back in 2 weeks, we'll start the process of turning you into data analysts. Cool. Any questions?